You will have 20 minutes, Dr. Dacey.
Thank you. Thanks to the Veritas Forum, and thanks to you all for being here. And to Bill, it's a pleasure to be with you again. A student from Fresno told me last night that this is the Bible Belt of California. I didn't know that. I'm from the Corn Belt myself, the Midwest. Actually, as a teenager, I was born again as a Christian. And although I've since left the faith, my interest in questions of God and meaning and morality has stayed with me, now I guess as a professional skeptic. It's not as easy as you might think. You know, believers get to go door to door saying, hello, I'm with the church and I'm here to tell you the good news. Skeptics like, hello, my name's Austin and I'm not really sure why I'm here. But that said, why am I so sure that there's no God? Well, you might think it's just futile to argue that God doesn't exist because, you can't prove a negative. Well, actually, I think there are a couple of ways to prove that a thing doesn't exist. One is to show that the thing couldn't possibly exist because the very idea of such a thing literally makes no sense, like the idea of a round square. The other way is to look very carefully and see if it's there. If you look as best you can for a thing and you still can't find it, then sometimes you can reasonably conclude that it isn't there. Both methods have been used to argue that God isn't there. Some have argued that God is like a round square, that some of his properties, like being all-knowing and also transcending time and space, are incompatible. They just couldn't possibly go together. Tonight, I'll use the look and see method. I'll defend an evidence-based case against theism. I'll argue that in light of the evidence, atheism is more probable than theism. In particular, there's insufficient evidence for theism, and there's overwhelming evidence for atheism. Now, I'm not suggesting you can literally look and see if God's there. Here's an illustration. Imagine that it's your birthday and your roommate has promised to bake you a cake when you come home from class. So you come home you arrive home expecting to encounter a few things. Pleasant aroma in the air, maybe some cracked eggshells, mixing bowls in the sink. But you find none of this. What you find is an unopened box of cake mix and a dozen eggs in the fridge, no roommate to be seen. That is, you fail to find a number of things you would expect to find had the cake been baked, and you find a number of things you would not expect to find had the cake been baked. Well, even before opening the oven and looking in, you can reasonably conclude on the basis of this evidence that the cake isn't there. In a similar way, we can reasonably conclude that God isn't there. We do this by considering what things we'd be likely to find if theism were true and what things we'd be unlikely to find. I'll focus on 5 varieties of this kind of evidence, although there are others. First, the hiddenness of God. Second, the success of science. Third, the connection between minds and brains. Fourth, evolution. And finally, the abundance of pointless suffering. In each area, we can ask what we would expect the world to be like if there were a supernatural person who's all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, who created the universe, and who seeks a loving relationship with humanity. And in each area, we discover that the world turns out not to be like that. Let's begin by thinking a bit about why we're here. We're here for a serious discussion of whether God exists. But is this really a question about which there can be a reasonable doubt? I mean, according to the book of Psalms, the fool hath said in his heart that there is no God, right? Well, if you think all unbelievers are just bonkers, then there's no point in debating one, right? The fact that we're here then suggests that there is such a thing as reasonable unbelief. But herein lies the first kind of evidence against theism. If this world were the creation of a supreme being who seeks a loving relationship with us, we would expect him to ensure that everyone believes in him, or at least everyone who's capable of reciprocating this relationship. I mean, if you don't even believe in him, you can't have a relationship with him. Instead, we find that countless billions have lived and died without ever believing in God, and they can't be blamed for their lack of belief, since many tried earnestly, deliberately, to find reasons to believe, but couldn't. Notice I'm not just talking here about non-religious people, but anyone who disbelieves the God of classical monotheism, is the subject of tonight's debate. For example, there are about 800 million Hindus, 350 million Buddhists, 225 million Taoists on this earth, and many others. Why hasn't God, the God of theism, revealed himself to all of these people? It doesn't take much imagination to think of ways that an omnipotent being could provide evidence that would be persuasive to all reasonable people. I mean, suppose that at the same time, everywhere around the globe, a booming voice declared, "Hello, this is God." What? No, it's not Morgan Freeman. God. You know, Alpha, Omega. So that would make me a convert. Or how about less Hollywood? God could simply give everyone a clear, unmistakable inner awareness of his presence. But clearly none of this happens. The philosopher J.L. Schellenberg, who pioneered this line of argument, has called the general situation divine hiddenness. The hiddenness of God is highly unlikely given theism. On the other hand, it's precisely what one would expect if there were no God at all. Related to but distinct from divine hiddenness, there's another way that God is absent from the world, and this offers another kind of evidence that favors atheism over theism. It has to do with the natural sciences like physics, chemistry, biology. These sciences seek to explain phenomena like fire or earthquakes or cancer by reference to natural causes. They don't appeal to causes like the intentions or actions of a divine agent that are thought to stand outside of nature. But nevertheless, they've been extremely successful at explaining the world and enriching our understanding, enabling us to predict and control nature. Every electric light you turn on, every aspirin you take is a reminder of that. The agnostic philosopher Paul Draper has recently pointed out that an all-powerful being who seeks a loving relationship with us would probably get involved in our universe. And so scientific accounts of that universe would have to take his actions into account. Well, if theism were true, then it would be extremely surprising that science can ignore God, as it does, and still explain so much. So the success of naturalistic science favors atheism over theism. It was once widely believed that the human mind must be grounded in a special immaterial substance or soul. This philosophy of mind is called mind-body dualism. The dualist picture of the person as an immaterial, immortal soul caught within this material, mortal coil is found in many religious traditions. But most cognitive scientists now reject dualism, and for two main reasons. First, it's not at all clear how an immaterial soul could cause changes in the physical body, as it's supposed to do. The soul is supposed to animate and control the body. Think about it. Souls are thought of as purely non-physical. They can't be weighed or split in half, heated or cooled. They lack mass, electric charge, and so on. But then how could they possibly have a cause and effect interaction with bodies which are thought to have only these physical properties? Second, there are lots of specific correlations between mental phenomena and brain activity. For example, language use and spatial reasoning appear to be localized in particular areas of the brain. Brain injuries cause very distinctive changes in perception, in cognition, even personality, what you might call our soul. Some mental diseases like schizophrenia have been shown to have a genetic component. But why would any of this be the case if the mind were independent of the brain? It appears mind-body dualism is false with respect to us. But dualism is more likely given theism than given atheism. That's because theism is already committed to the existence of at least one immaterial mind, namely God. He's conceived of as a disembodied consciousness. And further, according to many traditions, we are made in the image of God. And that means we have an essential commonality with God in virtue of our spiritual, everlasting substances. Atheism, by contrast, makes none of these commitments, and so it gives us no expectation at all that people have souls. The discovery that we have none, then, supports atheism over theism. Our brains are the most complex things we've ever encountered in the universe. It's no wonder that many people look on us as masterpieces of design that provide evidence for the existence of an intelligent designer. Nevertheless, if we look at how life actually arose through biological evolution, we find a number of features that are highly unexpected if theism were true. The evolutionary process, it turns out, is massively wasteful and inefficient. It works by randomly trying a huge number of possible designs and discarding all the errors. Well, this would be like a person who tries to build a bridge by randomly throwing up every possible configuration, letting them all collapse until through dumb luck one remains standing. Well, that's not design. That's crazy. Additionally, because evolution has to work by blindly tinkering with pre-existing designs, it leaves organisms with many traits that are functionally useless or even dysfunctional. Like the optic nerve in the human eye, it is routed back through your retina unnecessarily from a design standpoint, causing a blind spot. I mean, think about that. The organ designed for sight has a blind spot. Then there's the appendix. What's that all about? It doesn't do anything, but oh, by the way, it can get infected and you can die. And, did I mention, the birth canal isn't quite wide enough to really give birth. As the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume said, this looks more like designed by a government committee than by a perfect being. The inefficiency and imperfection of biological evolution are just far more likely on the assumption that it's a blind causal mechanism with no mind and limited power than on the assumption that it's the instrument of an all-powerful rational intelligence. It would be really surprising if such a being chose to create life in such a way. Therefore, evolution is another kind of evidence that favors atheism over theism. Finally, the evidence from pointless suffering. Every single day, an attack on children occurs that's 10 times deadlier than the attack on the World Trade Center. It comes from preventable disease like measles, malaria, and pneumonia. Doctors know malaria is a leading killer, claiming over 1 million children each year. It's usually fatal in young people if not treated almost immediately. The child's final experiences often include fever, shivering, severe pain in the joints, headaches, coughing, vomiting, generalized convulsions, and coma. Now, we would expect an all-powerful, perfectly good God to prevent this suffering unless he had some reason not to. Notice that not just any reason will do. For example, it will be no good to claim that God just doesn't care about the suffering of children. No, his reason has to be such that it morally justifies his failure to prevent this suffering. You might be tempted to think that there's some greater good that can only come about if these thousands of children are allowed to die in pain every day, or some greater evil that might obtain if they were spared. Well, is there? We can answer that question by carefully considering all the kinds of goods and evils that we can think of. For example, does humanity learn anything useful about malaria that couldn't otherwise have been learned? Apparently not. We already know everything we need to know to prevent it and treat it. Does it inspire you and me to be better people, to strive to save the innocent victims? For the most part, no, it doesn't. But even if it did, why should they suffer so that we can be more virtuous? That's not a morally justifying reason anyway. Now you might say, Why should we finite beings think that we could know the reasons that are in God's infinite mind? Here's the answer. If God loved us, then we would be the first to know the reason he permits bad things to happen to us. A loving father who has to take his child to the hospital for a painful treatment will explain to her why he does what he does. Now, maybe we're like very small children. We can't even fathom the reasons that God has. But in that case, a loving parent would do his best, at least to make sure that the child feels his presence and comfort and receives some assurance that there is a reason, even if she can't see it right now. So there's every reason to think we especially would be aware of any justifying reasons God has. What we in fact find is that many of those who undergo terrible anguish, like Holocaust sufferers, report feeling totally abandoned by God in their time of need. And of course, many victims of disease, starvation, or natural disaster die very young, having never believed in him. So if, after considering the matter carefully, we're unaware of any kind of state of affairs that would justify God in permitting suffering of this kind, we can reasonably conclude that there is no such state of affairs. But then, the pervasive suffering caused by malaria is pointless. I don't have to tell you that other examples of pointless suffering, from AIDS to earthquake to tsunami, can be multiplied beyond the breaking point of all our hearts. There is no more powerful evidence against theism than this. To conclude, have we proven a negative? Well, prove is a tricky word. Sometimes it means produce reasons that establish a claim beyond any possibility of doubt or error. We haven't done that, and of course, common sense and science doesn't rise to that standard either. What we have done and what can be done is to indicate a body of evidence that, when taken together, makes atheism significantly more reasonable to believe than theism. The hiddenness of God, the success of the naturalistic sciences, the physical embodiment of minds, the carelessness of the evolutionary process, the abundance of pointless suffering, and the lack of God's comfort in the face of it all make atheism more probable. But suppose I'm wrong about what the evidence shows. Suppose, contrary to fact, I'm wrong. There is a supreme being. To me, actually, that's not the end of the story. As I said, theism is more than just the belief that God exists. As the Bible says, even the demons believe and shudder. No, theism also says that it's appropriate, if not obligatory, to trust and love and praise God. Well, why? Presumably because he's so great and he created all this. He's essentially morally perfect. He necessarily does what's best. But think about that for a moment. If someone necessarily does what's best, then it's impossible for him to do otherwise. Now, trust is when you give someone the benefit of the doubt. You have confidence that he'll do what's best, even though it's possible that he won't. With a morally perfect person, there is no doubt, and therefore there's not even an occasion for trust. What about praise? We praise a person for her actions when they result from something that's up to her, like her will or traits of character that she's developed. We don't praise someone for actions she couldn't help doing, any more than we blame water for boiling. Well, if God is essentially morally perfect, then his morally important decisions, such as the decision to create the world, are not up to him. They flow necessarily from his nature, which is also not up to him. Therefore, his actions are not morally worthy of praise. Finally, love is a relationship between moral equals, isn't it? Such as best friends or spouses. But God is supposed to be infinitely morally superior to us created, flawed beings. Granted, there is a sense of love in which you can say you love things that are lesser than you. Maybe your pet hamster or Clay Aiken, I don't know. But surely this is not the sense that God is supposed to love us, right? And it's hard to see how his relationship to us could count as genuine love. Strictly speaking, the debate tonight is about the existence of God, yet most theists are concerned about more than this. They're not just telling you that this guy is out there, they're telling you that this is the guy for you. Well, tonight Professor Craig and I will be discussing the case for and against the existence of God, but I just want to point out it's worth remembering that even if Craig were to succeed in showing that there is a perfect being that created all things, he would not thereby succeed in showing that this being can be a father, a friend, a person you can really relate to. And in this sense, even if God exists, theism could still fail. Thank you.